Olá, boa noite. Nós estamos aqui na Livraria Megafauna para fazer o lançamento do livro Hans Ulrich Obrist, Entrevistas Brasileiras, volume 2. Esse livro, publicado pela editora Cobogó. Bom, eu sou Isabel Diegues, diretora editorial da Cobogó. Enfim, estou aqui para receber vocês. Bem-vindos a todos, obrigado por estarem aqui. Esse livro, Hans Ulrich Obrist, Entrevistas Brasileiras, volume 2, ele é, claro, a continuação do volume 1. Essa é uma série de publicações que a Cobogó vem fazendo. Os primeiros livros foram publicados em 2009, já, numa outra série chamada Entrevistas, Hans Ulrich Entrevista, em que a gente coletou e recolheu entrevistas que Hans Ulrich fez ao longo de mais de 30 anos, pelo mundo todo, com artistas, pensadores, antropólogos, historiadores, músicos, cineastas, fazendo a cada viagem, a cada projeto que ele fazia pelo mundo. Hans Ulrich Obrist, que está aqui com a gente, que é diretor da Serpentine Gallery, curador, enfim, tem vários livros publicados.
Recording in progress.
A gente... desculpa, houve aqui uma entrada técnica, me atrapalhei, mas vamos lá. Então, nós estamos aqui para falar dessa publicação, que é parte de um projeto maior da Cobogó, junto com o Hans Ulrich. Hans Ulrich, que vem fazendo suas entrevistas ao longo de 30 anos, enquanto viaja fazendo seus projetos, exposições e debates pelo mundo. No volume 1 do Entrevistas Brasileiras, o Hans Ulrich conversava com 36 artistas pensadores, dentre eles Oscar Niemeyer, Walter Zanini, Augusto Campos, Cláudio Andujar, Lígia Pape, Zé Celso Martinez Correia, Valtércio Caldas, Tunga, Cildo Meirelles, Paulo Bruschi, Oli de Freitas, artistas que fizeram a sua carreira, artistas brasileiros que fizeram sua carreira nascidos até 1958, ano anterior à inauguração de Brasília, e que eram considerados, e são considerados mestres, enfim, pioneiros, né, que é uma das buscas do Hans. Ele tem sempre entrevista esses artistas pioneiros, esses mestres. No desdobramento desse primeiro livro, a gente fez um volume 2 com artistas nascidos a partir de 1959, portanto, artistas que nasceram e cresceram durante a ditadura militar ou, enfim, né, desenvolveram seu trabalho a princípio dos anos 80, e alguns até mais jovens do que esses, já no momento de abertura do Brasil e, enfim, de todas as transformações de tecnologia. As entrevistas com esses artistas mais jovens começaram a ser feitas em 2014 pelo Hans, sempre em viagens pelo Brasil, ou mesmo pelo mundo, inaugurações de exposições desses artistas em museus na Europa, nos Estados Unidos, enfim, onde no mesmo momento estavam o Hans e o artista, e nós juntamos essas entrevistas todas nessa publicação, nesse segundo volume. Nela estão 30 artistas, dentre eles Luiz Zerbini, Arjan Martins, Jacques Lerner, Adriana Varejão, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Ernesto Neto, Laura Lima, Eric Rocha, Jonatas de Andrade, Emicida, Paulo Nazaré, J. Mombassa e Bárbara Wagner e Benjamin de Burca, que são uma dupla de artistas, trabalham juntos e vão estar hoje à noite com a gente aqui, conversando sobre o trabalho deles e sobre o projeto de entrevistas. Eu queria que o Hans nos falasse um pouco, antes da gente começar a conversa com Bárbara e Benjamin, sobre esse projeto de entrevistas que ele vem fazendo desde os seus primeiros momentos como curador. Ele já foi registrando e colecionando esses encontros com os artistas em todo o mundo, os artistas que interessavam a ele, que ele ia conhecendo, que ele ia descobrindo, ou mesmo aqueles que ele admirava, que eram mestres dele, etc. Hans, conta um pouco para a gente desse seu projeto de coleção de entrevistas que você vem recolhendo ao longo de toda a sua história profissional, de toda a sua carreira.
Yeah, thank you so much for this introduction. And actually, I'm delighted we can have a conversation with Barbara and Benjamin here tonight. The conversation project, so to say, started at the very beginning of my work as a curator. I began basically to visit artists when I was a teenager, traveling by night train in Europe. really one of the first studio visits with Peter Fischli and David Weiss, and they then sent me to Alighiero Boetti in Rome, to Rosemarie Trockel in Cologne. And so I would travel around Europe by night train and visit studios. And, you know, in a way, I think one of the really key encounters was actually one of these early studio visits with Alighiero Boetti, the late Italian artist and visionary in Rome, because Boetti said that he thinks that very often curators and exhibition organizers are asking artists to kind of participate in their exhibition, but they're very seldomly really ask artists what they would like to do, right? And so he said he has so many projects which are unrealized, which don't really fit into a box, which don't fit into any of these categories, you know, in the art world. And he said, you know, that should basically be my job. He said, I should basically listen to artists' unrealized projects, which cannot happen within the parameters of the art world, and somehow try to make those projects happen. And it's something which happened again and again, I think, also because I was very young. I was like 16, 17 years old. So artists gave me tasks, they gave me ideas. Rosemarie Trockel, for example, was also giving me advice. She basically said that it's great that I visit artists of my own generation and that I visit very young artists, but it's important that it's a transgenerational dialogue. And it was the beginning when Louis Bourgeois was really started to become visible in Europe in the 80s. And Rosemarie said, this is really great, but there are so many other extraordinary pioneering women artists who don't have visibility. And she feels we should go from city to city and really visit these artists. And that's, you know, what I've done ever since. I followed Boetti's advice, I followed Rosemarie Trockel's advice, many other artists' advice. They all became somehow my mentors. And that's also what happened when I came for the first time to Brazil for a conference. I actually asked several curators and friends, you know, it was in 99, who is a kind of a Louis Bourgeois figure in Brazil? And Adriano Pedrosa said, you know, that I absolutely had to visit Ligia Pape. And so we went together to visit Ligia Pape. We recorded a conversation. And later on, you know, then actually with Jochen Waltz made an exhibition in London. It was the exhibition in collaboration with the Reina Sofia. And it's actually really, I think, also important that very often these conversations I record are also conversations which have to do with working on something together, a book or an exhibition, which is why I, you know, very often would talk to artists again and again. So I think it's very often, you know, not just one-off interviews, but it's longer conversations, which I would say evolve over time. It has a lot to do with listening, no? I think Etelanan says that we need to learn to listen again, and the 21st century has to do with listening, and I think that's what this project is about. And I might never have recorded these conversations. You see, what is kind of interesting is I was wondering the other day why I started to record everything, because I have about 4,000 hours now of these, you know, conversations, and I really think it would probably not have happened without Jonas Mekas, because it was sort of in the early 90s when I had just begun, and I was in a cafe in Paris with Jonas Mekas, and he basically said that it's great that I have these conversations with artists, but it's a pity that I'm not recording them. And so then I suddenly thought, like, wow, I should record them.
Tá certo. Sobre essas conversas todas, o que a gente está, enfim, acho que é interessantíssimo o campo a coleção que você tem de entrevistas e o campo que você alcançou, registrando esses encontros, que são diálogos mais do que entrevistas, com artistas, mas também com pensadores, cientistas, enfim, pensando a respeito de várias questões, né, de arte, construção artística, a criatividade, a invenção, enfim, né, e as questões mesmo de cada um desses lugares, dessas sociedades, desses grupos sociais. Então, acho que essa coleção de entrevistas também vai alargando o seu sentido e ganhando uma dimensão da maior importância. Nesse livro que a gente está lançando hoje, Hans Ulrich Obrist, Entrevistas Brasileiras, volume 2, Hans começou a gravar suas entrevistas com essa turma a partir de 2014, e uma boa parte, talvez um pouco mais de um terço, menos um pouco que a metade, ou a metade, dos entrevistados acabou sendo sendo feito via internet. O Hans sempre vai aos lugares, visita os ateliês ou nas exposições, enfim, vai até o artista, vai até o trabalho do artista, mas com o impedimento que a quarentena e o isolamento social gerou, a gente, enfim, Hans teve que se reinventar no modelo de conversa e de encontro, mas não por isso deixou de fazer a sua peregrinação pelos estúdios e pelas conversas todas com os artistas. Isso gerou, por um lado, enfim, um outro desafio, claro, porque estar no ateliê, estar no estúdio com os artistas ou em lugares onde você tem a obra do artista com ele, enfim, né, em lugar junto, no olho a olho, é completamente diferente, mas também gerou a possibilidade de estar com pessoas muito interessantes que, eventualmente, não seria possível se não houvesse o encontro virtual, vamos dizer assim. O encontro com a Bárbara Wagner e o Benjamin de Burca aconteceu antes da pandemia, portanto, ele foi presencial, foi ao vivo, mas muito do que foi feito nesse livro foi feito virtualmente. E o livro discute, além das questões, claro, da arte, do trabalho de cada um dos artistas, enfim, seus projetos não realizados, as suas inspirações, enfim, né, sobre os caminhos do trabalho de cada um, discute também questões de gênero, racismo, a própria pandemia, o quanto ela tornou tudo mais agudo e mais complexo, a situação de cada um, a situação e a importância da arte nesse cenário atual, e todas essas coisas estão nesse livro, que vale muito a pena, enfim, conhecer. Então, agora eu convido Bárbara Wagner e Benjamin de Burca, que são uma dupla de artistas. Benjamin está na Europa e a Bárbara está em Recife, porque na pandemia estamos todos onde dá para estar, mas virtualmente, juntos e trabalhando, seguem trabalhando diariamente juntos, como me disseram agora há pouco tempo. E eles vão falar um pouco do trabalho deles, das últimas coisas que fizeram, para além, inclusive, daquilo que já está no livro. Queria convidar os dois para entrar na nossa conversa e estou aqui para ouvir com vocês e, enfim, conhecer um pouco mais das coisas que vocês andaram fazendo e pensando nos últimos anos. Obrigada, Bárbara, Benjamin e Hans Ulrich, e, enfim, estou aqui escutando vocês.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, and a very warm welcome to Bárbara and to Benjamin. And as you said, actually, half of the book was recorded during a visit, actually, in Brazil, and then the second half was recorded by Zoom. And in a way, these Zoom conversations, initially, it was quite complicated to start to kind of continue the studio visit. But then, as you said, I think it also led to a more decentralized, I would say, practice, because it was all of a sudden possible to also record conversations outside the big cities, because obviously very often the recordings did happen in big cities. So I would say that that was an important part, I think, not only in terms of the Brazilian conversation, but throughout 2020, I recorded in a much more decentralized way, I would say, than ever before. But as you said, the interview, the conversation with Bárbara and Benjamin happened before that, actually. It happened in Inclus Artis with Francis Reynolds, where we recorded many of the conversations. And I wanted today to ask you questions after the conversations, in order not to repeat what is in the book. I wanted to ask you what happened since then, because so many things have happened in your work. For example, the Venice Biennale. But before that, I wanted to actually ask you about Brega, because when we talked actually for the conversation for the book, you defined Brega by saying it was everything Bossa Nova wasn't. So in a way, you define it also as a theater of real life. And I mean, recently, of course, with the global success of someone like Anitta, the Brazilian pop singer, it seems that something you presented actually in the Brazilian series has very much hit the mainstream, right? And it seems Brega and Bossa Nova are somehow meeting in mainstream kind of music. So I wanted to ask you how you felt about the fact that this language is kind of being incorporated more and more in the mainstream.
So nice to be here, Hans. Oi, Benji.
Hi, Vivi. How you doing?
I'm good. we are super happy to be here. It's a beautiful occasion to be in conversation with you, Hans, after 3 to 4 years now. Our interview was in 2017. More than that, we are being with you now tonight to introduce to the public this publication, which is super interesting, important. We're very happy to be part of that. 24 conversations that are here. I started to have a look at that. Yeah, it's just very beautiful to be able to keep the conversation. As you said, we in 2017 had been working in Recife mainly. I think we talked about a work that we had made abroad, that was the one in Münster in Sculpturprojekte, a kind of brega that the German perform since the beginning of last century. But indeed, from that point on, we had, I think we produced a work on the rise of evangelic culture, let's say, in Brazil, cultural production, but also a film we made in Toronto with a group of poets called Rise, and then finally Swing Guerra, which is the work that you mentioned was presented in Venice 2 years ago. We made another film that we premiered in the end of last year in a very unusual situation in the south of France, in the city of Marseille, on the occasion of Manifesta. Tonight, we can touch upon some of these productions through the conversation, but I love the beginning already. I love the bringing back our conversation on Brega, on Estás Vendo Coisas, a film we made in Recife in 2015, a very different time, no? Now, 6 years later, you mentioned what happens to Brega, as in the music videos of Anitta, for example, as Anitta as someone who could be considered mainstream, what she is in Brazil, for sure. But indeed, Brasília Teimosa, a work that was made much earlier, before even I started the collaboration with Benjamin, as a photographic series in the city of Recife, in this fisherman community, in the very center of Recife. Brasília Teimosa was shot in 2005, 2 years after Lula was elected. And what I felt there, and that was a moment when we didn't have mobile phones with cameras, we didn't have Instagram being so popularized, we didn't have selfie as a form, no, the act of photographing yourself and immediately posting that snapshot, no. So the use of digital cameras and being able to be at that point in conversation with the people that were in Brasília Teimosa and having them perform together, no, like looking at what was going on, was an experience that for me has a lot to do with their understanding of identity through their own experience of consuming popular culture. So I would say that what happens at 15 actually years later in the beautiful music video of Anitta is that it's a little bit like, I don't know what Benji thinks about it, but it's a little bit like she's herself then in Brasília Teimosa. It's a little bit beyond that. No, she is herself a character in that, and the meaning of those images is different. Then I think we are in a moment where that is already considered to be an image of power and an assumption of a certain Brazil that's then more real, no? Real as in real. And I think what I wanted to say there wasn't really a statement. No, I was just really observing and engaging and maybe sensing there was something going on that I really thought at the time was really urgent to document, that was the building of a certain image of a Brazilian middle class. I think a new middle class in Brazil. It's a very different feeling, I find, but I like how she actually uses bossa and brega, and in a way, I worked with Benjamin in 2015, 16, when we decided to investigate the language of brega, the building, the construction, the industry, the production of brega music in Recife, the complexity of their language. It is very much connected to how we find that sophisticated. And I think the appearance of this super interesting approach of Anitta's The Girl from Rio just maybe confirms the fact that bossa and brega are actually really just two coins of the same story. But the sophistication of brega was already there. She just maybe confirms that.
I must admit, I actually haven't seen it yet. I've been so out, but it's just been in the background for me, as in terms of Anita's aesthetic. But I think it's true that it's more related to Barbara's earlier photographic work. And I think that in many respects, Barbara probably hit upon, and perhaps maybe the word reveal is probably the right word, in the sense it reveals something that's right in front of you, that's right there. So that these aspects of that are recognizable become mainstream is a testament to that, and I think it's a bonus. But just to go back to mention about the decentralization of your conversation, I think, you know, technology allows for that, and that's something very much related to this proliferation of a kind of an aesthetic and a new form of reimagining Brazil, or rethinking about its image presence that Anita has, because a lot of people that were operating in the world of brega and in funk very much and very powerfully took took technology full swing. I think probably more than many other places, Brazil really adapted itself very quickly to using social media. So, and in terms of a snapshot as well, your conversations as a snapshot, it's interesting because we look back at that snapshot from 4 years ago, and of course brega has developed incredibly since then. So it's a question of, you know, kind of requiting both of those worlds. When I think about that interview now, it feels like looking at a snapshot, which is very pleasant.
Thank you so much. And it's actually, as we said, almost 4 years since we recorded in Sao Paulo, and since then you've made actually 3 films. And I wanted to kind of ask you now to tell us a little bit more about these films. And you made them across different countries. The first one was Rise, which was actually shot in Canada. So after making a series of works in Recife, I kind of wanted to ask you what it meant to then engage with such a different community. And it would be great if you could describe a bit your encounter with the immigrant community, actually, of rap poets, which led to this film. And maybe also to tell us a little bit what were the parallels and differences to be drawn between them and actually the communities you've engaged previously in Recife.
Yeah, there are some, just to go to the final point, I think there are some strong parallels, but they're very hard to kind of pin down, because of course culturally and background are very, very dissimilar. But I think in one of the aspects is the question of the let's say the colonial hangover rather than post-colonial situation, but the hangover of it. So the elements that people are working through in these films since Swinguerra, including Rise and including the film we made in Ireland and France, kind of look at different aspects of how people are navigating a relatively new situation to them in terms of economy and class and race and sexual orientation, sexual definition, or self-designation. Yeah, that's one of the things that draws it together. I think in terms of Rise, one of the questions maybe underneath everything was a kind of a new, especially among the males in the group, was more a question of redefining masculinity, and adopting or retaking aspects that would be considered non-masculine. So appreciating vulnerability, for example, vulnerability became a big form that they would allow themselves to work through these questions and not be defined by outside forces that demand of them and a demand of their body to behave in certain ways. And in that sense, Swingeha and Rise have got similarities, but obviously the form of hip hop and spoken word and dance. And then on top of that and beyond that, the entire cultural backgrounding is different. But
I felt like talking just a little bit, it's a very different circumstance we are now, because I would like just to say a little bit of what is the film for the people who are listening to us, because if it was an interview just between us and Hans, we could just go on about the specificity of the piece. But me and Benji, in 2017, that was the second time we had been abroad. It is a very different situation for me now. I became a professional in journalism, in communication in Recife. So for me, as an extension of becoming an artist in Brazil, but then in the northeast of Brazil was a consequence of that. So the idea of going elsewhere to then maybe apply a certain knowledge or a methodology that we have already used here. We were trying beginning to develop a language. But in 2017, what was beautiful and important to say is that we met a curator. Her name is Emily Shangu, curator of the Art Gallery of York University, that commissioned the work. And this gallery in a university that is far from Toronto downtown, they had for many years a very interesting understanding of art and education. So they didn't separate both. So part of their program was actually engaging with the community around the gallery. That was exactly Jane and Finch and Scarborough. And through our relation with Emily, who was interested in asking us to come and visit and maybe think of a contribution for her program in that year, we visited Rise. But Rise was already part of their program. And that's very important to say. We didn't find the subject out there, as we also don't find this phenomena in and around Recife. These are things that are very present in our experience of the city. So Benji lived here in Recife for 6-7 years and is back and forth now. In between Berlin and Recife, but we work with mainstream, basically. We work with the things that are very visible, very much around us. The brega, the gospel, the frevo, and swingueira also is something that's really present in our culture in the city, and in the rural peripheral areas of Recife as well. But imagine how it would be to come to Toronto, a place that's completely unfamiliar to both of us. The fact that we could be brought to the community center where the Poets of Rise got together every week, with a free mic, open mic, to either recite some poetry or sing or to act or to dance or to play music. That was really beautiful. I think that was also a piece that brought an experience, gave us an experience of such an interesting complexity, because it was a group of people that would be called Rise, reaching intelligent souls everywhere. each of them had a completely singular story to tell every night, every Monday night, no, for the time we were there researching and then rehearsing with them. The film was shot in the subway station of the extension of Toronto subway to the north, exactly connecting the areas of Scarborough and Jellyfish to downtown. But what I want to say is that this experience of dealing with a community center that then was congregating people at the same time, a place to share similarities and differences, because we are talking about the Caribbean community in the north of the city, young people, young Black people that are second generation Canadian, first or second generation Canadian. They were very different from each other. But then we put together a group of 30 people, maybe 35 people, and rehearsed with them. We suggested, what if the community center is the brand new subway station that you're going to be using to go downtown? How would you perform in a platform? How would you use an escalator? How do you engage in conversation in a bench while waiting for the train? So it was a very playful, beautiful work we developed. But then with the staff of the gallery working as team for the shooting. So that was a very unique experience of having the structure of what an art museum could be, as in producing film in a very experimental way, as also part of the educational program. So that was really unique. Learned a lot from that for making Swinguerra, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And in Emily, as Barbara mentioned, she works a lot with artists that also can apply certain strategies in the community and make, kind of more collective, engaged practices outside and inside of the gallery. But in terms of her educational program, she calls it outreach rather than inreach. So it changes the kind of framework of how working in the community can occur, which is really important. It was a very, very beautiful time for us. It was a very interesting moment to also delve into different forms of the communication, whether it's a battle or whether it's read out or whether it's considered as thought. And so all these different expressions allowed for something that's accessible, but not necessarily simplifying in its effect and in its message. No, and the truth is that there's a huge amount of very complicated ideas embedded in there, and for myself and Barbara to work with them and utilizing the underground system, and the underground as well being an important factor, that it's a passageway, and it's a passageway and not a destination. So there's a movement through it, which is exactly what these youngsters are experiencing in terms of their understanding of their own identity, in terms of their understanding of where they're going. So there's an introduction by an elder, Duke Redbird, at the beginning, at the end, and in a way that was a kind of a filmic symbolic gesture of the land acknowledgement, which is read out in Canada and starting to adopt slowly in the United States, but it should come faster. That basically, like we would have had it here in this conversation at the beginning, when it comes to Brazil, that we acknowledge the land that we're standing on is not ours. It is the land that was taken from the indigenous peoples that were on this place before we arrived. So it's an acknowledgement that is being borrowed. This land is borrowed, and as a gesture in terms of its use in the public and in schools, it's a real field leveler, let's say, between those who came before, or those who say colonized, or those who consider themselves Canadian, probably whiter and have more established. They have just as much and just as little right to the place as a new immigrant, or whether it be in the case of Canada, the kind of economic immigrants from the Caribbean in the 70s and 80s. So the second generation, of course, naturally in these situations that also happen in London, as you well know, and across Europe and everywhere else, when people are introduced as economic immigrants, they're also marginalized practically immediately and begin from the bottom. So Duke is there at the beginning and at the end of the film, underneath the earth as well, with these young Afro-Caribbeans to present this notion that you know, the land is not, there is no such thing as property in the sense, there is no such thing as ownership. And it's an important symbolic gesture, I find.
Thank you so much. And I was actually thinking a lot again recently of this idea of a museum in the Caribbean. Actually, Edouard Glissant wanted to build, where he basically said that he wanted an institution. The philosopher and thinker Edouard Glissant wanted to kind of build an institution which would be an archipelago, because he said the archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Glissant says, and that's actually from conversations I had with him, continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through the exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self. And it's archipelagic thought that teaches us this. And that seems such an important and urgent message for the 21st century. And of course, Glissant's activity as a poet, as a philosopher, as a public intellectual, as a curator, always encompass also the production of reality, going beyond exhibitions, going beyond books. He was a member of the resistance who spoke out in favor of Martinique's independence from France. He then founded in '67 the Institut Martiniquais d'études, a school which was an agent for change, intervening in political issues and implementing Creole into a school system which at that was basically dominated by French. And later, and that's how I met Glissant, he imagined and prepared actually a museum for Martinique, which remained unrealized, but which was really a source of many of his ideas. He imagined this museum as an archipelago which would not house a synthesis, but a network of interrelationship. He wanted to create a museum which actually would not only point at urgencies, but also find agency to respond to these urgencies. He imagined, as he told me, this place to be a quivering place which transcends established systems of thoughts, in which is looking for, and actually which is looking for the utopian point. And that's now, I think, the main definition, right? He wanted to have an institution which is looking for the utopian point where all the world's cultures and all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another. So I was very curious, thinking about your work happening, of course, within institutions, but also your work happening within society, how you imagine an institution for the 21st century. If you could invent a new art institution, maybe not a museum, but an art center, how would it be? How would this structure work? And would it revolve around Brega? Would it revolve around manifestations in a way of the outskirts? It just made me think of Glissant.
It's just a beautiful coincidence. We talked about Emily, who we worked with for those years, who is a friend now who we like to be in conversation with. She was reading Glissant a lot when we were doing Rise, which is a beautiful coincidence that you just talk about it now. But I don't know, Benji, what do you think in terms of what would that be? I mean, it's interesting how me and Benji as a duo, we also have a different experiences of what it is art, what it is to be an artist or to be a professional artist or an amateur or even to be educated as artists, how we consume art. So the experience we had in Brazil brought us to work with the frevo dancers in frevo schools, with the brega singers and performers in nightclubs. We followed the evangelic singers in the churches also, this work Sem Guerra is mainly an exercise of understanding what it is that the dancers do when they rehearse, but also present their choreographies in competitions in a sports court of public schools. So I like thinking that we are so interested in these different spaces, no, where people consume, produce art, experience art with their bodies and with their understanding of knowledge, production, and exchange also. So I would say that would pretty much look like one of these places that we bring to the museums. Maybe that's what we do, Benj, when we bring our installations to the museum. We want it to look like a sports court or like a school or like a community center. No, it is very much this desire that's there in how we want to use the space of the museum while showing the pieces, which is something that we are also developing more recently. Our understanding of the display, what it is that we do when we are researching and then when we are shooting, the collaborative aspect of our work that is so present in the research and production. But then when it comes to the museum or to the film theater, it's so much about the display, no? And then we have been working more and more in understanding our responsibilities in that, our understanding of the circumstances in which the works are shown, but also mainly the space, how we consider space. And we have been working on installations that I would say are maybe a hint on our visions for what the museums could feel like.
I was reminded with this by our own experience that we had when we were very early in our kind of collaborative career, when we made our first moving image work on the island of Reunion in the Indian Ocean. And there was a museum project there that we were researching that a woman, an academic thinker called François Verger was working on, and it was to be a museum with no objects, because objects in this sense is kind of predatory in the sense of collecting artifacts to represent the basically the exploitation of those people. You know, this as we well know, and it's very much in the present world, you know, debate in terms of museums and their uses in traditional sense. This project was never realized, but apparently, and I think it's something that was more anecdotal when we were there, and I got a little bit obsessed by it because we had just finished Edifice Recife, which is also a little bit like a museological work across the city of Recife, documenting the sculptures outside of the edifices around the city, of which there are about 4,000 to 5,000 registered sculptures, which is amazing. But there were a huge selection of objects that were supposedly, anecdotally told us, were involved, perhaps a little bit more along the lines of Lino Bobardi's collections of objects that have their own stories, that are personal objects or trinkets or functional objects or objects that are made locally on the island. It's a small island, and it's also very much an example of creolite, or considered one of these creolite examples, a bit like the archipelagos. And because of the political machinations of this museum that never occurred, these objects that were collected then were returned somehow or subsumed back into the island. They had been taken and then reintroduced, probably in various different places. No one really seemed to know where these objects were, if they had been returned or if they were kept together. And I found that really interesting, that maybe the museum is that exchange, is the island. You know, we take an object and we place reverence on it because it's inside a cabinet, but we might pass it in the backyard of someone's house. And in that sense, if we were to consider a museum just to be like our entire planet, it wouldn't be such a terrible idea. A little bit like Lewis Carroll's kind of one-to-one map, where we realize that the actual ground without the map is easier to navigate the map itself. And so a museum, yeah, we could all be the objects and the curators, and maybe that way we'd save the planet as well, because we'd respect it a little bit more, because museums are also full of all of the informations of this planet, not just art. And yeah, so basically our planet should really be the museum.
Thanks for the great answer. Of course, Lina Bobardi brings us to Venice, because I just came back from the Architecture Biennale in Venice. The first sort of big exhibition actually I've seen since the multiple lockdowns, and of course there was also the exhibition Peter Fischli curated, painting show at the Prada Foundation. There was a Bruce Nauman show at Punta del Dogana, but it was mainly architecture. And of course Lina Bobardi, the recipient of the Golden Lion, and in a way very present, and through that I was also thinking about the amazing experience I had actually with Lina Bobardi working in the Casa de Vidro, when with Isabella Mora we curated the show where we invited artists to intervene, to inhabit in a way actually the Casa de Vidro. And of course Venice, when I was in Venice, I had also many memories of your extraordinary pavilion, in actually in the 58 Venice Biennale, and your film Swinguera, which was presented there. It was a video installation and a series of photographs, which was developed in very close collaboration with dance groups on the outskirts of Recife in the northeast of Brazil. And I want to ask you what it meant for you to do this pavilion and to have such a very strong political piece at center stage in an international biennial. Would be great to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's traumatic.
Maybe talk about that wasn't a coincidence. The curator Gabriel Pérez Barreiro had been in touch with us in the end of that year, 2018. We had just finished Rise. We had been back to Recife, and we were beginning the research on Swinguera. It had already the name even, because we had been very familiar with the competitions of dance groups all over the periphery of Recife through Eduardo Lemos, who is a dancer in the first film that we made here in Recife together with Pedro Sotero, our cinematographer. Eduardo Lemos is in Pasquivai, and from that point on in 2015, we got to understand that Swinguera is a very, very powerful, complicated form of dance and expression in general in music in Recife. Difficult to explain, Hans. It's like it was really tough, no bench, for us to be in front of the pavilion trying to explain to people what Swinguera brings in terms of the nuances between Swinguera in Recife and the Pagode Baiano in Bahia, from funky carioca and the brega funk in Recife, but also the tradition of quadrilha and forró that are performed here during the festas juninas. Very complicated. So we had to find a challenge to come to a place where we were bringing our own practice, our own methodology. It never felt like we were doing something different, and that was really beautiful to share with Gabriel Pérez Barreiro, who then, back to the end of 2018, he asked us, he interviewed us. Maybe he was doing the investigation on the artists he was considering to represent Brazil in Venice in the following year, and we talked about the competitions of Swinguera, a little bit on the characters of the film we were about to produce. We didn't have any plan on when the work would be finished, but we were beginning the research. I think a month later, he calls us from New York, and it's the 28th of October 2018, and me and Benji are in the kitchen of my apartment here in Recife, 7 in the evening, it was the exact moment when we heard Bolsonaro was elected. So there were fireworks when Gabriel was saying to us, I want to officialize the invitation for you to represent Brazil next year. And it was such a strange feeling we got because of the circumstance. So it took us a couple of weeks to really understand if that would be possible at all. And there are many interesting things to say on the occasion of our understanding, that was the research that we should follow, that the groups had, because the groups had their own work. So what we see on screen in So em Guerra, the 3 groups that are performing Extremo with the choreography that honors the Brazilian flag, the group La Mafia that is dancing brega funk in an amphitheater as the dream of one of the characters that is a little bit gothic, no? There's a moment she wants to leave the sports court and go to a darker scenario. That's the La Mafia with this name, no? And then performing more sensual and a little bit more of a theater. And then finally the Passinho do Maloca, that is very much performed by young Black men, more than women, but the male figure that is mainly that one of the young men who are the supporters of the Brazilian football teams, who are also very much considered to be those malocas that are going to rob you in an arrastão in a praia in Rio de Janeiro. Very much part of the whole image of the male, Black male, young male that is connected to funk in Rio. So a very stigmatized body that is then in Recife creating a very humorous, playful choreography that is a Passinho do Maloca, like as if they are puppets, performing the violence that's projected on themselves. So we did that with them in that moment when they were preparing to the competition. We had no idea actually that being in the beginning of the mandate of Bolsonaro, who canceled the rights of the LGBT community in the constitution already in the beginning of that year, 2019, that would be, that would add so many layers to the piece. We were just, as in all the works we do, collaborating with people that we found to be fundamental to be in conversation with in that moment. And then they bring all those issues that are in Venice, which is a very problematic institution as a biennial in the sense of the national representation. We are then there in that year, the first year of Bolsonaro, with a work that is talking about the fight for the rights, that those characters, the dancers, the people that we worked with were claiming in their choreographies.
Yeah, I don't know if it was with a great deal of reservation if we hadn't already established our research and our interest in Extremo, and also in what they were presenting in terms of choreography for the competitions that were coming up. Probably would have had to say no to representing Brazil. I mean, not to invent a work out of nothing, understand, but the work that we were making seemed to be quite perfect in the sense of maybe exactly to counterpoint this idea of representation, in a sense that Brazil with Bolsonaro in power, which is very much the hierarchical, linear thinking, toxic, masculine sort of form that Brazil was then suddenly being oppressed by. So to adopt a work that represents Brazil, that flourishes with kind of a relational thinking, more open-minded and non-binary, as the future is non-binary, was pretty accurate. So in that sense, we were good to say yes and no, and understand that their representation of Brazil there is on the screen. It's on both screens. In fact, you know, we place the viewer or the spectator, the audience, entering into the dynamic where they are also in the work, you know, in the middle of the film. They're also observing as they are observing on the screen. They have to work out what they're seeing in relation to their own physical presence there. And I think these aspects were all really good too. And in many respects, was received with a lot of cathartic kind of responses. People were pleased to see a reply, let's say, to the moment in Brazil,
At the same
political
time,
moment in Brazil.
but I don't know how you felt, Benj, but there was, for example, a Brazilian journalist that published an article in an important Brazilian paper that was there. I mean, very few Brazilian journalists were presentially there. Some interviewed us by phone, but there was this desire from their side for us to say that our work was a protest against Bolsonaro's what Bolsonaro would represent, you know, in terms of our country. If that was a protest, and that was a tricky one. It is part of what we have been learning in the sense of scale, know how our practice is becoming public, and how we get to communicate with different audiences and different, we made Swing Guerra for Brazilian audiences, let's say. People in São Paulo don't know about this phenomena in the Northeast. And then we are there, and then we are replying to a question that is from a Brazilian journalist asking, is this a protest against Bolsonaro? And then we say, no, it isn't, because it is something that the people who are in the film, who have been practicing swingueira in the sports courts, they rehearse 2 to 3 times a week. They take 2-3 buses to arrive. They live in different peripheries of the city, but then there's only 1 or 2 places where they can use at night when they're not studying or working. Then they meet. They take ages to arrive, and then they meet and they rehearse exhaustively, but also having a lot of pleasure. To this only one presentation in the year, where they are now competing, and they are extremely competitive, but they don't get money from it, which is something that for us was very new, because in all previous works, the flavor dancers work during Carnival, and they get the money from the industry of tourism. You know, the brega singers, they want to make their hits, they want to be Anita, and they are there, and they make their music videos and super quality recordings on YouTube. And then the gospel singers, the same. Swing Guerra was completely different. They were just fighting somehow. Like every other day, they would arrive and spend hours rehearsing to be super rigorous and a military kind of attitude to the synchronicity of their gestures. And that was for us then an understanding of the making of a sense of community, because these are people who are suffering from police brutality every day, no? And they are mostly also having a lot of difficulty to get employed, no, to make money, and some of them were not able to make their own living, so living with their families, where they also suffer a lot of prejudice. So we were really working with. That's why I say it was somehow very similar to Rise. Because every time we were there working with Extremo, and Diego Matarazzo, who is the choreographer from Extremo, like fantastic to work with. He was basically the one in the house that would be super concerned with the health, no, the work of each of the participants of the group. Remember that, Benji, in the end of the meetings, you know, every time there was a cesta básica. I don't know how to translate that. Yeah. It's like the basic that you need to survive during the month in terms of groceries so they would be helping each other also. They would know of each other's life, and then it was a very strong experience. And that wasn't a protest against Bolsonaro, in the sense that that would reduce a lot of the piece somehow.
No, it's definitely not directly a protest against Bolsonaro, but sometimes to not fight against someone who you feel is attacking you is the best strategy to defeat them. So, I mean, in that sense, what we were doing, myself and Barbara, we were working with a community of people in a certain place, was very much about the specifics of these phenomena that we were working with. From that point on, in terms of display, like we mentioned earlier on, we had to incorporate certain ideas with the physicality of that modernist building, which also did reflect a certain, you know, degradation of that building in Venice, and the degradation of the school in which we shot on location in Recife. So there are aspects of a kind of continuity to talk about where we are in Brazil, where Brazil is, and where we want it to be. You know, I mean, what we want to promote, what's good about it. And in that sense, when we just entirely focus on that, we are basically, you know, I don't know, defeating somehow on a level by not engaging, let's say.
We are just not. We were just at that point, that was in the beginning of 2019. At that point, I think we were not even acknowledging that would represent Brazil. So that we didn't want Bolsonaro to be associated to the piece, because we didn't feel that was the Brazil that was represented in the film, actually. Né? That was our way to also protect the integrity of the artistic direction of the dancers also. So all this instrumentalization that the arts really do, I mean, the press, and then I think this is very violent in terms of Venice. The exposure that we get in Venice, it does try to flatten everything, no? And the works we do are not necessarily going to one side or the other, but it is keeping the complexities there.
Yeah, not to simplify. Yeah, sorry.
No, sorry. After you. Why don't you finish?
No, it's just that subjects are complex, and they should never be simplified just for the sake of I know everyone seeks to find a simple answer, but actually we should embrace complexity in this sense. And if there's anything to be said about that, it's like an intersectional approach to thinking and to understanding where we are. It's kind of going back to the museum thing, but sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I thought it brings us actually to the third film, the third project. It brings us to the extreme present, because actually during the global pandemic, you have been doing another film, 100 Steps, shot actually across 2 countries, again with a lot of research. It's actually, again, a collaborative project of yours, which transform visitors in performance in a way. Can you talk a little bit about this most recent work?
Yeah. Do you want to begin, Benj? Benj is the Irish. Benj is the Irish guy here. Irish German.
Yeah. It's complicated to talk about in a very simple way, but the film is kind of a tribute, a little bit of a tribute of one of the people that was also present in the film as a documentary filmmaker that we discovered during our research. And actually the themes that we were thinking about in terms of what we wanted to approach in the film were already mapped in a different way and in a quite a subversive way by this documentary filmmaker who shot a series of films, a documentary basically for television called Atlantean, where he introduced the fact that it's a possible reading of history or prehistory to understand that Irish culture and its formulation has its roots in the north of Africa and the Middle Eastern basin, because at the time, of course, traveling across Europe is not something that happened so easily. So the motorway, let's say, of European communication was by the coast, by the sea angle, and Ireland in that sense is placed somehow in the middle of the north to the through the Mediterranean basin to Africa. So he draws parallels, cultural aspects and parallels that are there both in the language, in the visual production, in certain religious aspects, but specifically in the music and dance form. So and in the boats that are also present along this coast. We really like that idea because it subverts this idea of Ireland being Celtic, i.e. kind of European, and Celt as a term doesn't really mean anything. It was originally a Turkish word to talk about Europeans or people over on that side of the area, but then it got adopted as an idea of a tribe that traveled through and around and ended up in Ireland, and then those cultural aspects are what we understand as Irish. Ireland as a Celtic place. But that's a very simplistic reading, and our interest in making a film in Ireland at that time was to again talk about kind of a colonial or post-colonial situation where Ireland on one hand has become very, very comfortable with the fact that it's of its European identity, and Britain, as you well know, on the other hand, is kind of holding on to empire in some very kind of strange and sad way, and Ireland looks on in a kind of, you know, with a certain sense of the absurd, let's say, but it does generate a lot of problems with the Northern Irish border, of course, and it generates naturally a lot of problems with the idea of immigration. So our response to making parallels with culture was to also bring a certain parallelism in terms of the people who are represented in the film, in terms of what they do. It's less so, but the reading of where they do it in these museums, these houses that are bourgeois and aristocratic, and are fundamentally very linked to the people who are producing music in the houses, but it's not the music or the culture that these houses produce. It's the kind of the colonial situation. So the point of the film, I suppose, it pivots on the question of how history is told and fundamentally who's doing the telling. Again, it's a little bit interesting because, you know, we made it over the pandemic, and with the pandemic, which agitated an awful lot of these social injustices and inequalities among race, among sex, you know, abuse, and how everything that the pandemic has brought us to understand is that we have to fix a lot of situations, and one of them being an ongoing institutional forms of colonial thought, and with that racism and classism and porophobia and everything else. So the film is a little bit like a way of trying to deal with recreating forms of understanding how we can tell history, but in the present. I think it's something along those lines. So I don't know if you want to completely come with something else there, Barbara.
No, I think you said everything in your way. I mean, we have different ways of saying. I love Bob Quinn. I was in love with him.
I forgot to mention his name. Yeah, it's true.
Quinn, you said that Bob Quinn, amazing work, full of humor, and yeah, Benji always wanted to make a work in Ireland after being in Brazil for so many years. So we were there. We were supported by the Irish Arts Council. We of course, before the pandemic, we were there, like freely understanding the tradition of the. There are competitions also in Ireland, like competitions on tradition. It's fantastic. I mean, they meet every year. There is a competition of who sings the best Sean-nós song, and they are children that are doing the Sean-nós dance. And I was really fascinated by that. Up to the point we met Bob Quinn, who is 85 now. Brilliant. We've had this fantastic series of works he developed for TV. Super, like the one who made the first feature film entirely spoken in Irish in the 80s. So we were very happy to meet him, and we came across Atlantean also through Michael Hill, who works in the Temple Bar Galleries in Dublin. We thought of making this very simple structure of telling a story of Irish visitors to a museum, a British museum, and the Arab visitors of a French museum. And basically, they are visitors in the beginning because we were actually in this house that turned into museums, Art Deco museums. And intentionally, we were trying to also talk about the history of the British Empire in Ireland through the building of the 100 Steps. That's where the name of the work comes from. In the garden of that house, a staircase was built by Irish workers during the famine years. So the 100 Steps also has this kind of intention of talking about the famine that was relieved by the British when they hired the Irish to build the stairs by an exchange of, what was that, soup? Anyway, the work is simply this understanding of how they would tell their versions of their stories, and they are pop songs, no? I love that.
Well, they're pop songs, but from the 16 or 1500s, no? I mean, but they're not only pop songs. They're not only pop songs. They're vernacular kind of exchange of songs, but they are also deeply politically motivated, and there's hidden motivations within them. So the Shannon song that's sung in Ireland, there's 2 verses of it, is Roisin Dubh, and Roisin Dubh is translates to Black Rose, but it is the name of Ireland in many respects. So when talking about Roisin Dubh, they're talking about Ireland, and when they're talking about a character, they're talking about England. So a way of hiding political dissent and resistance against the English armies and the British occupying forces in Ireland over those very fundamental years of oppression. They were forced into both recording their history by oral methods of song and dance, but also disguising within them messages and kind of politically motivated messages, and that's very important to also to state, because they do come across like light and pleasant pop songs, but behind them or underneath them is very dark and deep waters. And I think this is the first time Barbara and I kind of dealt with history on a level that goes so far. I mean, with what we were doing in Brazil with Brega, we were looking at something that was happening right at that moment. We're making a snapshot, a little bit like the conversations, with Ireland. We were kind of delving into looking at these aspects that go back to 400 or 500 years. So it gets a little bit kind of complicated. But
thank you so much, because I know that we are out of time, and actually so many more things to ask you. So hopefully we can continue this conversation soon in real life. Thank you so much to Barbara. Thank you so much to Benjamin. Thank you so much to Isabel. Thank you so much to all of you who are listening tonight. And I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel.